Well, good morning from here in London, but I am absolutely delighted to have as our guest today Dr. Deborah Elms, who is the founder and the executive director of the Asian Trade Centre. Deborah is extremely well traveled, and in fact, we met in Budapest last year, but today she's dialing in from, of all places, Cambodia. And so, whilst I'm no big fan of COVID, I don't think anybody else is, nevertheless, we have to confess there are a few advantages as we've adopted our working styles and are able to draw in many more people from around the world for the discussions that we all need. And today's discussion is about Asia's noodle ball of trade. Deborah will explain it, but we've often heard things like spaghetti and things, but this is about noodles. And we're going to have a look at things ranging from ASEAN to CPTPP, and if I can ever say it correctly. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors of Zealand, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce so many of these wonderful webinars because our sponsors, as presented here, allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today we're definitely going to be talking about economics and finance, and believe it or not, also about technology as we look at digital trade agreements as well. Now, the format today is one well known to many of you. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from our expert, Dr. Elms. Deborah will be speaking for 20 minutes, and then we have 20 minutes of questions and answers. So it's a good, fun, interactive session. And that leads me to 3 points of quick housekeeping. Yes, the slides are available and will be posted. Secondly, yes, this is being recorded, and after a bit of editing, it will be up in approximately 2 working days, i.e. just in time for weekend viewing over popcorn with your family. So you should have a lot of fun there. But thirdly, and most importantly, these are meant to be interactive. How can you do that? Well, you use the GoToWebinar question and answer facility. Deborah and I are here with you. We are not on Signal or WhatsApp or WeChat. We are not watching our emails or on LinkedIn. So if you want to ask Deborah some questions, type them into the GoTo Q&A facility, and I will feed them to her from 10:25. All of your questions, comments, observations, pointers, whatever you like, will be sent to Deborah with your email attached to them so that she can respond to you if she wishes. So please do use that facility as much as you can. Finally, I must say, personally, and this is as a former master of the Worshipful Company of World Traders, it is a spaghetti soup there from my Italian origins, or it's an Asian noodle bowl out there in the Far East. And yet a lot of clarity is starting to emerge, and these agreements are clearly becoming more and more important in a world where there are increasing frictions over trade, sanctions, etc. So I think today is very, very timely, and I look forward to Deborah's comments. Deborah has, I believe, 3 polls, and I think we're just going to have a quick look at the first one. Is that correct? Great. So just before we start, this poll is coming up. What is your level of knowledge on trade agreements? You're an expert, you've got a basic clue or two about it, and you've heard of them, and you don't know anything. Deborah, our audience is really quite opinionated. Whoosh, over half of them have already voted, as one might expect from a bright group of people. And we're just going to close that poll now and present the results. And actually, it's quite good, yeah. 63% have a rough understanding. Well, hopefully by the time Deborah's through with you, you will have a very smooth understanding or think that you're an expert. So Deborah, with no more ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have an audience that at least has heard of free trade agreements and is here willing to listen to me talk about the noodle bowl here in Asia. So I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly because I want to make sure that I give time for your Q&A. And as mentioned, you can have access to the slides after the fact. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me. I'm happy to chat offline later. Okay, so the Asia region is obviously trade dependent, as many of you know, export oriented in locations, including Cambodia, where I sit right now. The lion's share of their domestic economy is actually geared for exports, and that's true across all of the markets in this region. So this is a part of the world that has become very enamored with, and has been for a while, with the signing of various kinds of trade agreements. So let me take you through a few of those. Next slide. There we go. All of you on this call, of course, are aware that we've gone through some significant disruption. We have had pressure on the global trading regime, especially as some of the largest players in trade have changed their minds about the value of trade for their domestic economy, the value of trade agreements and trade institutions for structuring interaction and engagement between one another. Those pressures were happening before COVID. And then in comes COVID, which of course, as all of us on this call, I'm sure, are keenly aware, we had both supply and demand curves disrupted globally and has resulted in significant changes for business. So we already had a system under strain. We threw COVID in there. Governments have really grappled with how can they continue to protect domestic economies while keeping markets open, while generating revenue, et cetera. That tension, which has always been there, has gotten much more intense, especially in places like Asia, where the impact of COVID has been rather severe. And finally, and there are of course lots of things we could talk about, but just to set a little bit of the context, here in Asia in particular, as with the rest of the world, we're watching very keenly what is the extent of decoupling that we will see in the future between the United States and China, and what sort of opportunities and challenges is that going to present to different economies across this region. And that impact will be felt differently in both different economies, but also within sectors across this region. Next slide. So one way that we think it's important to have greater certainty, lower your risk and have greater certainty, is to leverage many of these free trade agreements. Now, the good news about FTAs in Asia is that we have a lot of them, and we have more of them coming all the time. One of the latest announcements of new negotiations just came out with the EU announcing relaunch of discussions with Thailand. We're having trade negotiations this week between the United States and 13 members across Asia in what is called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. So this trade agreement and trade integration is a very common thing in this region. Now, they don't solve all of your problems as a business, but they can reduce those risks and lower the uncertainty of engaging in trade. Every one of them is different. Many of the models that we use here in Asia are different from the models that Europe tends to like. They're not wildly different, but they do have variations between them. So it's very important that you look at the specific agreement that covers the trade that you are keenly interested in, because you can only use a trade agreement between partner pairs. So your market and a partner country. You cannot hopscotch between deals. So you can't use one agreement to get to Asia and another agreement within Asia. Okay, they only work between members. That said, let me just be clear, because some of you sitting not in Asia may say, what is the point of listening to all of this about Asian trade agreements? There are sort of two reasons for that. One is, of course, if you're an investor, then you care about opportunities for investment in and around the region and the economic growth and so forth. But also because even if you are not necessarily yourself sitting in Asia, or you are not an Asian registered company, depending on what you do and where you do it, you can still take advantage of trade agreements in the region. So if you have a branch or a subsidiary or whatever here in Cambodia, and you're trading with Japan, you can still use Japanese and Cambodian or ASEAN agreements to do that trade, even if you are yourself European or from the UK, even if you're registered elsewhere, et cetera. It's about what you do and how you do it, and how the trade agreement classifies you as being part of the agreement or not. So you can still use trade agreements. It's still worthwhile to hear what we're up to here in the region. Next slide. Many of these trade agreements are quite complicated, and they're complicated for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which, of course, trade matters in Asia. I'll leave this slide for you to look at on your own after the fact. The next slide. I want you, if I could please, ask you to do this. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to hand this back over, but I was going to just say, please let me know what you think is the most important trade agreement. Hopefully you've heard of some of them. Yeah, and then I will tell you my view on them.
This is the tough one, folks. You got to select one of these 5 areas, which is really the most important. Oh my gosh, actually, it's a good. Oops, noops. For a second there, the audience very much had the right answer in the lead, but it's slipping. 3/4 of the audience have voted, so I think we can go ahead and just post those results now. ASEAN, but they were
Fantastic.
doing really well early on. I'll leave it to you to tell them what the answer is, though, Deborah. Thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, partly it depends, to be honest, on what it is you're doing and where you're doing it. So again, if there's only one agreement that covers your pair of countries, then that's the best agreement for you. No matter what else the alternatives are, if there's only one that applies, then that's the one you're going to use. So if you're in ASEAN, sending to ASEAN, ASEAN agreements are the best. If you're in some of the ASEAN countries supplying with others, maybe there are others that are better. So I'm going to talk about not all of them because we have hundreds in Asia. I'm just going to talk about a couple and give you some highlights. The next one. I'm going to start with the most recent mega regional called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is now in force for all 15 members, actually. We finally got the Philippines in. The next slide. This one matters because it's all of ASEAN, all 10 members of ASEAN, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and it's the newest. It's important also because it's the first time that China, Japan, and Korea have been connected to one another. It's a comprehensive agreement. It is not like European agreements. I mean, it's comprehensive, yes, but there are loopholes because it's Asia and we're much more flexible. So there are about 20 chapters in here. 14,000 pages of country-specific schedules. It covers goods, services, investment, trade facilitation, e-commerce, intellectual property rights, government procurement, etc. So it's a comprehensive agreement. It's designed to be a platform in Asia for trade in Asia. And because it's brand new, we're not sure how successful it will ultimately be. But I think if you're not paying attention to RCEP and you are doing trade in and across Asia, you have missed an opportunity. So pay attention to RCEP, and I'll give you a little bit more details here in just a second about it. They are developing a secretariat, and it is likely to expand as early as this summer. I know Hong Kong has already asked to please join RCEP. So the next slide will give you a few more details on what is in RCEP, and I'll be very brief about this. But basically, we have the ability now to use one agreement for trade in goods. So if you want to manufacture a product for trade in Asia, you only have to make it one way, and you have access to lower tariffs or often no tariffs in and across the region, with the caveat that it could take a while to be fully entered into force because some of these cuts are very long and very slow. But the fact that we have one deal, one set of processes for manufacturing, send it in and across Asia, I think is extremely important. The next one talks about the next slide talks about the importance of services and investment. Many of you on the call are in one or the other. Of course, you can do services and trade and investment across Asia now. The difference between now and as RCEP is coming into force is that RCEP helps limit the flexibility or policy space of governments to change regulations at a whim. So we are supposed to be creating a more stable, consistent, risk-free, or at least lower risk environment for both services trade and for investment in and across the region. It should be much more helpful. And if there are challenges that you face in any particular market, you now have the advantage of saying, here's the text of the agreement, here are the commitments that you have made, how can we help you implement them effectively? And that will help you solve some of the particular challenges that you might face in and around Asia in dealing with some of the commitments that members have made and some of the flexible regulatory approaches that we see that are common in Asia. The next slide. I just wanted to say, as a sort of bottom line to RCEP, we've had a lot of trade in Asia. So people will say, what's the point of this new agreement? We've had a lot of trade in Asia, but there are also a lot of barriers to doing trade between Asian economies, and RCEP helps set a boundary for trade in Asia for Asia. It will take some time. There's going to be some teething problems along the way, but increasingly you should think of Asia as a potential final market on its own to supplement or potentially someday replace, we don't know, the current final markets, especially for goods and increasingly for services. So I think it's important to see RCEP as that platform for further discussions in the region, and it should improve over time. It should be upgraded, it should be expanded, tariff cuts should come down even further, more services added. So this is the base. It will get better over time, as we have seen on a lot of Asian agreements. The next one. So that's RCEP, and I'm happy to answer questions around this. The next agreement that I want to talk about is the alternative, what is often called the alternative mega agreement in Asia, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. This has been in the news, and many of you may have paid a lot more attention to it now that we have the UK, who is negotiating accession. It's proven to be challenging, in part because, actually not because of Asia. It's proven to be difficult because the Canadians and the UK are back and forth over dairy issues. But here in Asia, most of the markets that are here are keen to welcome the UK into this agreement because it expands the benefits and because it provides new market opportunities for exporters and provides a larger market here for UK exporters into Asia. We're already on what is called year 6. So basically, almost everything is tariff-free now within CPTPP. All services, all investment already opened, with extremely small exceptions. And so I think for companies, if you want to say what is the best agreement, generally it's CPTPP. Most comprehensive, most ambitious, provides the most benefits for companies, the most intense rule book, the commitments by members. I think it's very, very helpful. And it's going to expand again. So after the UK finally gets done, then we are supposed to open for accession. And in line now, also problematic, but potentially exciting, China, Taiwan, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador. So we've got a long list in the queue already. So this agreement, important on its own, important as it expands. Next slide. What makes the CPTPP different? Now, the CPTPP, some European-based audiences in particular will say, but that's not the EU, which is true. It is not the EU. We do not have 30,000 people who are figuring out rules and so forth. That is not this. But as a comprehensive trade agreement, it matters because it's broader. It covers all goods, all services, all investment, government procurement, e-commerce, etc. It's also deeper. So we have new rules in intellectual property rights, which is very important in and around Asia, where we have inconsistent approval of IP. Also a labor and environment chapter, customs rules, etc. And everyone has the same rules. So there's not that sort of Asian flexibility that we often see, which is so problematic for companies. These are the rules. They apply to all of you, whether you're a developed economy or not. So Vietnam has the same rules as the United States would have had they not dropped out, as the same rules as the Japanese, the Australians, the Canadians. Next slide. So the CPTPP, very important. I just want to mention briefly, because this does matter for especially upgrading the domestic level conditions in the region. The European Union, very active, and they just announced this week that they are going to relaunch negotiations with Thailand. Very important for those of you who are trying to do trade in Thailand, which can be very challenging. And so it's a signal that Thailand might be ready to do some domestic level reforms, extremely helpful. We could all, in Asia, use some more reforms in Thailand. They have agreements already in place with Singapore. It's not very good, but the Vietnamese one is fantastic. So if you happen to be in Vietnam trying to trade with the European Union, it's excellent. Happy to answer more questions about that in the future. But the real point is just that the European Union, very active and trying to expand its footprint in and around Asia in a way that helps reinforce commitments in TPP and RCEP. So we're constantly upgrading the level of competence, the kinds of rules, the alignment of regulations. I think that is extremely important for companies. The next slide, and I'm getting close to the end of my prepared remarks. I just want to mention the IPEF because it's currently right now under negotiation with the third, depending on how we count it, the second or third round underway this week in Bali, and I thought it might be useful for you to hear about it briefly. So IPEF is an American effort to come back economically into Asia after they departed from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But IPEF is a very different animal. So these other things I was talking about, particularly RCEP, CPTPP, European Union agreements, those are concrete. They have market access, they have legally binding commitments, they have schedules of what it is you agree to do. IPEF is not that. IPEF is an attempt to say, could we think about trade differently and discuss some of the issues for the future that matter to us around supply chain resilience, around decarbonizing green climate, circular, blue, greens, a little unclear what, because they're still negotiating, whatever that will be. something on tax and anti-corruption, and then there's a very long, fat pillar on trade, which really has nothing to do with trade, but has something a little on digital, but labor, environment, gender, indigenous issues. So a whole lot of things that potentially matter a lot, but are not necessarily covered in a traditional trade agreement. So I just wanted to highlight what it is as you hear news stories coming out potentially during the negotiations this week and into next week. So that's IPEF. Next slide. That is the end of my overview. So I have gone very fast through a bunch of noodles in the noodle bowl. Now there are a lot more that I could discuss. I've only gone through those, but I thought that gave you a bit of an overview. And again, please refer to the slides after the fact, and I'm happy to discuss it in more detail. We have tons of materials, as you can see. And then let's get into the questions of the things that actually matter to you or the kinds of concerns that you may have. So thanks very much for listening to the prepared remarks.
Thank you, Deborah, and for being absolutely punctual. I absolutely adore it. We've got quite a few questions here. Folks, we've got quite a few people online, so do get your questions in early. And as you know, we're fairly strict on time. Now, Deborah, just before we get cracking, a number of people are quite interested in what's the role of your center in all of this? What do you do as well as all these resources?
Great question. So we work with companies and governments on trade and trade policy. So what does that mean? Some of our clients we're a little odd. In Asia, we don't have the same institutions that you have in Europe, for example, or you have in the US. So we work with companies on how to use trade agreements, what they want to see out of trade agreements, but we also work with governments to make sure that governments understand what business is looking for, that they create trade agreements that are helpful, and that they understand how to explain what they're up to the business community. So we're kind of that bridge between companies and governments on trade issues.
Okay, and do you directly work on FTAs yourself?
We do. I mean, we're not, to be clear, I don't want to be in the negotiating room, because then if I were, I can't say anything to anybody. So over all of these negotiations, we've been very active. We've been discussing things with negotiators. We've been talking to the business community. We work with a lot of small businesses as well. So feeding in information about what seems to be useful, what's not useful. In some trade agreements, we're far more active. So RCEP, we were very, very busy on e-commerce. In particular, because at the early stages, just to give you sort of a flavor of this, at the early stages of the RCEP negotiations, there was a big argument over whether or not digital should be part of the agenda at all. So it took a bunch of rounds of really holding the hands of ASEAN members to get them to understand that you can't make a trade agreement for this decade if you don't include some digital trade rules. So just to get to that point was important. And then, okay, now we're agreed to do it. What are we going to do? What are we going to talk about? Another whole long conversation. We didn't get all that I had hoped, to say the least. It's actually a wretched chapter, but at least it was on the table, and we had 8 years of discussions and negotiations over this, and had an opportunity to highlight some issues that matter to companies. So that's the sort of thing that we do.
Now, I've got a lot from the audience, but I just want to make sure I understand your presentation. Of all of the noodles, it seems to me you're saying CPTPP is the noodle.
CPTPP is the best noodle for companies because, as I say to folks, we can save you money or find you markets using CPTPP because it's that comprehensive, that broad, that deep. Okay. We can't say that with other things. So RCEP has some exceptions, some areas that are not covered, some pairs that are a problem. Lots of things are better, but not everything. And so as a company, I think it's always best to have a regional agreement. More members is better. And to have it be as deep and broad as possible, because that way you get whatever you're trying to do is probably included, as opposed to a super narrow something or other, which is hard to use, or a bilateral agreement, which can be challenging to use. So deep, broad, regional is best.
Great. Okay, let's get cracking on some of these here. Clive Bullen, has Brexit helped the UK get better FTAs than they would have in the Eurozone?
I think it's a tough one because there was an opportunity, or there is still an opportunity, I suppose, as the independent UK to negotiate trade agreements that are UK specific. So in some cases, when you're part of the larger grouping, there are things that are not on the table that you actually would like, but you can't because the larger group says no. Or there are areas where you would like to go further, but again, the group says no. Or where you would like to be more protectionist, but the group says no. So I think the advantage of being not in a group is that you have more ways to make a tailored, individualized kind of outcome. So that's the plus side to being not in the EU. The negative side is that you don't have the same power over anybody that you're negotiating with as you do when you're with a bigger group, right? Because now you are one against whoever else you're negotiating. That can diminish your ability to get what you want. So just to give a simple example, and I'm going to throw some folks under the bus, and I actually don't know the answer to this, but I suspect it. I doubt very much that Canada would be quite so obstructionist in the CPTPP right now to UK if it were part of a larger entity. But because it is not, the Canadians, I think, say, why not push for what we really want and have the UK change its policies as a result? So I think, again, it's part of that group once you're in a bigger group, which is why these regional agreements are often, I think, more interesting. You get different kinds of outcomes.
Okay. Chetanraj Dhillon, is it a good rule of thumb that the more trade agreements a country is part of, the better their prospects?
Yes, but. So my first instinct is yes, because if you agree to do a lot of trade agreements, to me it shows you are outward oriented, you are keen to cooperate with others, you recognize the importance of interaction and cooperation and harmonization and lots of things that matter. You are willing to change your domestic level circumstances to meet a variety of external circumstances. All of that is great, except some trade agreements are signed not for economic reasons. They're actually signed often for security, for politics. So as an example, and again, I don't want to throw Jordan under the bus, but there are lots of agreements signed with Jordan, and I think we could agree it's probably not because they have such an exciting economy that everyone wants to deal with Jordan. So sometimes you sign them for other reasons. There's a lot of agreements with New Zealand, and I love New Zealand to death, but you're not always signing an agreement with New Zealand because you care about the New Zealand market. You do it because you want practice. And they're very good and they'll practice with you. So fantastic, let's work with New Zealand. If we get it wrong, it's not catastrophic. So I would say yes, in general, if you have more trade agreements, it shows a flexibility. So that's why Vietnam is so popular right now, because they've been extraordinarily active in signing agreements with ambitious partners, but a little less with some of the others, just because they could be signed for different reasons.
Okay. Peter's going to slide back to that CPTPP summary slide to show people. I've also got a comment here from John Taylor. Digital trade is important. However, there are legal barriers that require key trade documents to be in paper form. For example, bills of ladings. John would like to work with you to help promote law reform and contact you. John, as I said to everybody, if you want to contact Deborah, just stick it in. She will be getting your comment there with your email attached. Hugh Purser. Deborah, Hugh's curious, are sanctions the elephant in the room?
Wow, are sanctions the elephant in the room? I would not have said that myself. I mean, to me, if you said on trade, certainly, what is the elephant in the room? I think one elephant in the room is the extent to which, again, the bigger players are ready, able, and willing to hold the global trading system together and to hold the principles of the global trading system in their own actions. Now, the reason that matters so much, I just gave a whole talk here about the importance of free trade agreements. It matters, the global system matters because if you think about it, that is essentially the foundation of a house. The World Trade Organization commitments are the basement. They shore up everything that gets built on top of that, which are free trade agreements. You can have tiny one little shack in the corner. You could have a huge, multi-story skyscraper. You could have one that cantilevers out over something else. I mean, you could do a lot of stuff, but none of it will work if the foundation is not steady. And so as we continue to undermine that foundation by actions, particularly by big players like the United States, potentially the Chinese, et cetera, then it becomes wobbly, and all of the stuff that's built on top of it becomes wobbly as well. So I would say the elephant is what happens to that foundation. And one of the big problems to me is that companies especially have forgotten that that foundation is so central to what you do. So you don't really pay attention to it, you don't work on it, you don't lobby on it. Nobody ever asks me what's going on at the WTO. Nobody's interested. Except that if it collapses, suddenly you're going to go, well, damn, that was actually important to us. We should have done something about it. So to me, the elephant is our foundation is awfully rickety right now. And if we don't do something about it, we're in trouble, because we can't discuss things like sanctions or subsidies or climate change if we don't discuss what's going on in our foundation.
Okay. Funnily enough, this is a question I had on the WTO, really in two parts. Is CPTPP almost going to, effectively become the WTO if it grows with China and the US and all that coming in? You're at kind of a very interesting level there, where it's like, well, okay, the foundation is now the entire building. That's kind of one question. And the second one is maybe detail, maybe not, but of course the US was blocking, the negotiation process and the complaints processes in that. And is that still the case?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So, could the TPP become a replacement for the WTO? I mean, I think that we're not quite at the level where we need to find a replacement. There's still this discussion. Can we shore up the walls? Can we, I don't know, put in some kind of glue that holds the cracks together, something? Can we come up with something? But if it doesn't succeed, then we better think fast about alternatives. And so CPTPP has been mentioned as a potential alternative. I think it's possible, except that we still only have 10 members who are in the CPTPP. And so I think the gap, I mean, I'm sitting in Cambodia as an example. I think for Cambodia to join CPTPP would be a leap that they are not yet ready to do. They joined the WTO. It took them quite a while, but they joined the WTO. They've leveraged that very well. I think it's been very successful. But to go from WTO to CPTPP right now would be too hard for them. So I think, if this is the future, I think it's going to be a problematic future. But I think it's one way to think about what would come after that if the foundation, in fact, implodes. So we'll have to see. And one of the reasons why our foundation is under threat, where you can see the cracks, is, as you mentioned, the dispute settlement system at the WTO, which has been broken now for several years. And the discussion about how do we fix it has led people to create, I suppose, to keep using my metaphor, they've created like a whole shuttering system to go over the top of the foundation and to try to pour concrete into it to try to hold the foundation cracks at bay. How well that works is a little unclear, in part because we don't have that many members who are part of that alternative dispute system. We just had a big announcement on the trade front this last week where Japan said that it would actually join this alternative shuttering system to hold up things, which is a very big deal because the Japanese have been extremely reluctant to either make those kinds of efforts that admit that there's a problem, and crucially, second, to, without actually pointing fingers at the United States, to take a position that is opposite the United States, which is, yes, we will do whatever we have to do to make this work. That's actually a very big deal in this weirdly, geopolitical, turbulent world that we live in right now.
Well, I think you and I could probably torture this to death with conservatories, outhouses, ponds, goldfish ponds, garden drives. It's a good one. I like your metaphor. I think it's good. But I certainly would prefer the WTO to work, because I still can't say comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, all the time. I prefer WTO as an acronym. But anyway, very, very good information there and speculations. Just a quickie, though, in a sense, we've got two areas that the audience are intrigued about, I can tell, that seem to be blockers. And I'll start with the first one, and I'm not asking you to speculate too much, but Andrew Harland, what impact will the recent discussions over future military developments by the US, the UK, and Australia have on future trade agreements? And I'll tack on to that, China, Taiwan, and US. So, basically, military has risen in importance in trade in a way that it wasn't seen to be 3 or 4 years ago.
I think the jury is still out on where we go from here on the level of geopolitical tensions folding into economic issues. And particularly here in Asia, we have always had tensions. I mean, the neighbors always have issues with one another of all kinds, sometimes very controversial, sometimes a little less, but they have always managed to sit together and do trade and economic discussions. They've managed to do economic assistance, engagement, et cetera, regardless of how bad it is. I mean, so during the 8 years of RCEP negotiations, the Chinese and the Australians were at loggerheads over a whole lot of things. And yet in RCEP, for 8 consecutive years, they sat Australia, China, because it was alphabetical. So they literally sat next to each other. During that same period, South Korea and Japan refused to even be in the same building in a lot of different settings. But they also, because of alphabet, sat next to each other in RCEP 8 years. So I think it shows to me that Asia has been able to sort of separate politics and security from economics. However, as we go forward and we're getting some real challenges on the politics and security front, that may be breaking down. So I say to people often that for Asia, the rank order has been economics and then way down the totem pole, politics, security. And that for the US, it's been probably security, politics, and then way down the totem pole is economics, and then Europe is somewhere in between, closer to the US. When you have those two systems that potentially are coming together, it's a little unclear what that means. Does that mean that Asia becomes more political, more security focused? Does that mean that the rest of the world is able to detach the economics discussions and say, well, they're not quite related? It's unclear where we go from here. But I will tell you that in Asia, huge amount of concern about what happens if geopolitics and security concerns, which we have been able to ignore for a long time, become part of the economic narrative. What does that do to an integrated region that is so trade dependent?
Yeah.
There are a lot of historical animosities here, and if they all blew up, it would be a disaster.
Right. And then a second area of concern, really coming out of Andrew Ross, does TCFD, TNFD override all these agreements? For instance, the COP target for net zero, who monitors and reports on it, things like that.
Right now, we have trade that, you know, it sort of has a little bit of a bubble. This is what it does, and then everybody else does something else. So the UN process on climate is its own, that they're doing climate. However, I think that's not so sustainable in the longer run, because clearly there are going to be trade implications of climate, and climate is going to develop some solutions that will have trade consequences. So we need to have a place where you can have a discussion about trade and climate. That's beginning a little bit. Actually, we're having a trade agreement approach to managing some of that. New Zealand is particularly pushing this. So maybe that's the solution. We at least need to make a platform for those kinds of conversations about trade and climate. We could use something similar. That's why the digital trade agreements have become so popular, because we haven't got a good platform for discussing digital issues, whether it's, as was mentioned earlier, the importance of paperwork or electronic signatures. When we move to bills of lading, what does that look like? When we look at digital identity, how could that facilitate? There's like, where else are you going to have those conversations? So there are increasingly conversations that will matter on the trade and economic side, and trying to find the right house for them or the right location for them has occupied a lot of time for some of the governments, especially here in Asia. Okay.
So really interesting there. So we knocked off the military issues. We've talking about the green issues, and of course there's a third area of, you know, fairly sizable, which is the digital space. You know, Hugh Purser wonders, you know, it seems intellectual property issues will become increasingly important, if not dominant. How might this affect? And then of course we've got things within the digital space. There's the GDPR over here in Europe, and the various other agreements on data sharing. But of course, we're now seeing stuff on artificial intelligence, where we've got an AI Act in Europe that could, in fact, quite seriously impede trade. So a lot happening there. We've got time for just two quick questions, if I might. John Taylor, again, would you like to make any comment about what's being done in Asia, especially to grow cross-border trade by SMEs, or is it not? Is it kind of size agnostic?
all of the governments in Asia, like most of the rest of the world, frankly, are small and medium-sized enterprise heavy. So, you know, even Singapore, 97%, Cambodia, it's 95%, 98%, something. You know, it's very high levels of SME engagement and activity. If you can't get small businesses to grow and you can't get small businesses to trade, you can't get economic development and growth, full stop. So how do we get that done? That is proving to be difficult. So you can have the rhetoric about why small businesses matter, but ultimately you need to be crafting rules that are favorable to small businesses. That's actually tough to do. So Asia's getting better at it, but one of the challenges, there are many challenges we have in Asia, but one big challenge I would say is that we do not have in most Asian economies the same kind of stakeholder engagement that you have in other places. And that stakeholder engagement is not diverse and robust. So you're not bringing the small businesses in to have a dialogue about what is it you need and crucially, what is it you don't need. You just assume that you know what they need. And so not surprisingly, you get outcomes that are not helpful. So I think this is becoming important, you know, and getting small businesses to do better business is crucial. That's one of the ways that I think the digital discussions are super important in this region, because it's clear to even government officials who are clueless on digital that many of the small businesses are in the digital space. And if we don't do something to help the digital economy grow, then we can't help the small businesses grow. So that dialogue between digital policy, digital rules, and small businesses, I think is important. And as it goes forward, hopefully, we get more SMEs represented and more policy outcomes that are SME friendly.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to close on a tiny question. Dan Feeney, would the UK joining CPTPP delay any bilateral trade deal with the USA, given the Chinese complexity?
Okay, so would UK entry into CPTPP affect UK-US?
Yep.
I don't think so. I mean, I think the US reaction to the UK is related to several things, but not CPTPP entry by the UK. I think it's much more about the current administration is not interested in trade, and they're definitely not interested in the same kind of trade arrangements, which is why we've gone down this IPEF path.
Yeah.
So, and that's not, I don't think, very desirable for the UK, because the UK at the end of the day would like to have market access into the US and would like to have a lot more economic engagement than an IPEF would offer. So I think that is just a bigger problem that has to do with the US domestic politics and the orientation of the United States. It's not about whether it comes into TPP. Well, the question I thought you were going to ask me is, if China were to join the CPTPP, would the United States join? And that answer, I think, is no. But I don't think the United States is going to join CPTPP either way.
Yeah,
and if they do, it's some far distant thing from now. So I'm not convinced that keeping China out encourages the US to get in. I don't think the US is interested.
Well, I'm getting a lot of comments of an extremely positive nature about what a great presentation and discussion, which is always a sad sign that it's time to draw things to a close. And if I may, I'd like to close on 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, before you see our sponsors, and I'd like to thank them again. They do allow us to range quite openly across what we'd like. I'd like to thank you, the audience, and you'll see before you the events coming forward, which I shan't read to you because you know, you can go to the website, which is the quickest way to find these things. But we do have a full week next week. Most importantly, on Thursday, the launch of Global Financial Centers Index 33. Who would have thought it back when we began in 2005? But my serious and most sincere thanks must go to you, Deborah. You're clearly an authoritative expert who really knows her material, and it is great to watch you in action. I'm really delighted that you put so much effort into this and shared your immense knowledge on these subjects with those of us who are at the foothills of trade, not the foundations. I'll leave it at that on metaphors. However, one of the great things is a little tradition here is that we're unable to thank you properly with applause, and we have traditionally used a particular piece of technology to provide that. And it is so appropriate today for Asia's bowl of trade noodles. This is our Korean karmic clapper, which will substitute for audience applause. Yes, from a lovely little temple in Bulgoksa. And I'm afraid that's all we could do by way of proper applause remotely. One of the great disadvantages of technology. But Deborah, thank you so very much for coming on today. We really appreciate
Sure.
it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out.